My name is Lana Sheffield, and for most of my life, my family treated my accomplishments like background noise. A few weeks ago, I decided to test that one last time. I dropped a message into our family group chat saying I'd been invited to receive a national award, that the ceremony would be broadcast live, and that it would mean a lot if they showed up or at least tuned in. I watched the typing bubble flicker, bracing myself. My sister answered first. She laughed at the text, called it a stupid award, and said she was going to a concert instead. A moment later, my mom chimed in. Then my dad added the line that stuck with me. Don't blame us if we don't go, like my biggest night was some optional errand I was trying to guilt them into. I read their messages twice. I didn't argue, didn't explain what the award actually was, didn't tell them who would be in that room or how many people would be watching. I just smiled, typed a single word, "All right," and put my phone face down on the table. That decision changed everything. The night of the ceremony, their concert tickets didn't stop what happened next. While they were screaming along to songs, my name was being read out on live television, my face filling the screens above their heads, and suddenly, everyone around them knew exactly who I was, long before my own family really did. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Oh, understand how all of this could happen. You have to know what it was like growing up in the Sheffield house. On paper, we looked like any other family in a quiet Las Vegas neighborhood. In reality, our roles were set long before I was old enough to notice. I was the kid who handled things, the one teachers never had to worry about. My older sister, Blair Sheffield, was the person everyone revolved around. If Blair had a game, a rehearsal, a new obsession, the week bent around her schedule. My younger brother, Corey Sheffield, was the baby who got away with almost everything as long as he kept people laughing. My mom, Donna Sheffield, liked to joke that she had a star, a helper, and a comedian. She never meant it to be cruel, but it told you exactly where I stood. My dad, Keith Sheffield, worked long hours and came home ready to hear about Blair's latest big thing. I learned early that if I wanted time with him, I needed to wait until after she finished telling her stories. It started small. A project I was proud of would be pushed aside because Blair had a tournament coming up. I would mention something from class and my dad would nod, then turn to ask about Blair's practice. When Corey cracked a joke, everyone turned to him. When I spoke, people used that moment to refill drinks or clear plates. None of this was dramatic enough to point at and call unfair. It was a series of quiet choices that taught me my news came second. I stopped trying to compete with Blair's performances and Corey's antics. I became the one who fixed problems before anyone else noticed them. If a form needed signing, I made sure it was on the table. If the internet went down, I reset the router. If my parents forgot an appointment, I reminded them. The more responsible I became, the less they seemed to look directly at me. They loved the results, not the person producing them. They saw a reliable function, not a daughter with her own life. By high school, I rarely bothered to share anything unless a teacher forced a parent conference, and the praise had to be delivered for me. Blair was 3 years older, and in her world, there was always an audience. Coaches, choir directors, even neighbors spoke about her with the kind of excitement that made my parents glow. When someone at the grocery store asked about our family, they led with Blair's latest performance and Corey's jokes. I usually did not come up unless the person pushed for more. I told myself I did not need the spotlight. I leaned into the one thing that was mine, solving problems without fanfare. I found my way into a field where the work mattered more than who was doing it, where I could stay behind the scenes and let the results speak. It suited the version of me my family had trained me to be, the person who stepped in quietly, fixed things, and left before anyone noticed. Years moved that way, Birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings followed the same pattern. Blair's plans set the tone. Corey floated through on charm. I kept everything running. If I shared a win, it landed like a small, polite detail, and then the focus shifted back to whatever Blair had going on that week. When the opportunity for the national award first appeared, it did not feel real. It started as an email from a committee asking for more information about a project my team had completed. I answered their questions and went back to work. Even when they wrote again to say I had been shortlisted, I did not rush to tell my parents. I could already hear how the conversation would go. Instead, I kept it to myself while the process played out. There were phone calls, interviews, and long forms that asked me to explain why our work mattered. People from the organization spoke to my boss and to collaborators who had seen the impact up close. Each step moved things forward, and still I stayed quiet at home. The official invitation arrived one afternoon in my inbox while I was between meetings. It spelled out the date of the ceremony, the venue, and the fact that the event would be filmed and broadcast. My name sat there in a way I had never seen it before, tied to something that could not be brushed aside as a small private win. I stared at that email for a long time. For the first time in years, I had something my family could not easily minimize, a moment that would exist whether they cared or not. For a brief stretch of time, it was just mine. By the time that invitation landed in my inbox, my work had already been quietly changing my life for years. I ended up in emergency communications because it was the one place where my habit of picking everything apart turned into an asset. I joined a small team that built software for cities, tools that tried to shave seconds off response times when people called for help. My part was the routing engine, the piece that watched traffic patterns, hospital capacity, and call histories, then suggested where each ambulance should go next. In a city like Las Vegas, where casino lights stayed on all night and sirens never really stopped, a few seconds could separate a scare from a tragedy. Most of what I did lived in code repositories no one outside the building would ever see. I spent late nights scrolling through call logs and sensor feeds, looking for weird patterns that could slow a crew down. When the system worked, there were no headlines and no speeches. A dispatcher's screen lit up with a clean recommendation. A crew reached the right door sooner, and life kept moving. The first person who treated that work like more than background noise was Dr. Selma Rhodes, the director of our research group. She noticed that I volunteered for the ugliest data sets, the tangled cases that made other people's eyes glaze over. Instead of telling me to relax, she pulled me into conversations about architecture and failure modes, and she said out loud that my need to understand every detail was a strength. Under her, our project started as a quiet pilot in one part of the city. After the software went live, numbers inside the department began to shift. Average response times dipped. Fewer calls bounced between stations. Dispatchers sent short notes after rough weekends saying they felt less helpless. We read every message, fixed what was broken, and rolled the system out a little farther each quarter until our maps covered the whole valley. The nomination for the award came from outside our office. A regional coordinator pulled data from the past year, built charts showing how many people had reached care faster, and sent the whole packet to a national committee that tracked public safety innovations. I did not know my name was even in the conversation until Selma asked me to step into a conference room one afternoon and close the door. She told me the committee wanted to talk to the person who had designed the core of the routing engine and that every arrow in their documents pointed to me. There would be interviews, she said, and a long review process I would mostly hear about secondhand. I felt the familiar urge to wave it off. In my head, it was still just code, just pattern recognition, just me doing the thing no one else wanted to sit with for that many hours. Selma would not let me stay there. She reminded me of overnight shifts spent watching live dashboards, of the stubborn bug that had taken an entire weekend to trace, Of the time a dispatcher called our on-call number in tears because the new system had moved a crew into position just in time. If recognition came, she said, it would be less about clever math and more about refusing to walk away from a problem until it behaved. The review stretched over the next few months. The committee sent lists of questions that forced me to explain our work in plain language. They asked for anonymized timelines of calls handled under the new system. They wanted to know what it meant, in human terms, for an ambulance to arrive a few minutes sooner on a busy weekend night. At the office, we kept shipping updates and handling incidents while the decision sat somewhere far above us. It was easier to focus on the next deployment than to picture whatever room those people were sitting in with my name on their agenda. When the official email finally arrived, I had to read it twice before it made sense. The seal of a federal agency sat at the top of the page. The message said I had been selected to receive a National Public Safety Innovation Award, that the ceremony would be held in a downtown hotel ballroom, and that the program would be recorded and broadcast as part of a larger event honoring different kinds of service. There was a line about bringing guests, a brief note about possible media interest, and a link to a schedule thick with security instructions. For a day, I kept that news inside the walls of our building. I forwarded the email to Selma and my manager. People stopped by my desk with stunned smiles and awkward high fives. Someone printed the invitation and taped it to the break room fridge. My team lead joked about practicing our posture in case a camera panned across the row. Selma squeezed my shoulder and said quietly that the award did not change who I was. It just meant other people were finally being forced to see what I had been doing in plain sight. It was only that night, when I sat alone at my kitchen table with the information packet spread out in front of me, that the section about guests stopped feeling theoretical. In the middle of the page was a simple sentence: "You may invite up to 4 family members or friends." I stared at those words long enough for the ice in my drink to melt. I pictured empty chairs in the row reserved under my name. I pictured my parents and Blair under the neon glow of the strip, completely unaware of what was happening across town. Part of me wanted to keep the whole thing to myself, the way I had treated every other win that did not fit neatly into their idea of a big deal. Another part of me, the smallest and angriest one, wanted them to see this whether they understood it or not. By the time the sky over the desert had gone fully dark, I had made up my mind. I opened our family chat, wrote out a careful invitation, and sent it before I could shrink it into something they could ignore. The night of the ceremony arrived faster than I expected. By late afternoon, I was in a hotel room downtown, standing in front of a full-length mirror while a stylist pinned the last edge of a dark dress into place. The invitation had called for formal wear, the kind of polished look I usually only saw in news segments and fundraising galas. Under the soft lights of the room, I looked like a version of myself I barely recognized, someone people might actually stop and stare at for a moment before moving on. Downstairs, the event was already unfolding. Security badges, check-in tables, and printed programs turned the lobby into a controlled maze. Staff members in headsets moved between clusters of guests. Each person there represented a category of service: public health, education, infrastructure, emergency response. My name sat in the middle section of the program, tucked between people I had only ever read about in briefings. I moved through the motions the way the organizers had taught us during rehearsal. Meet the coordinator. Hand over your phone for a few minutes while they confirm your details. Pose for a quick photo in front of a banner with too many logos. Accept a badge with your name and the word honoree under it. Follow a staff member into the ballroom where cameras waited on silent tripods. The room felt unreal. Round tables filled the floor, each one marked with small cards. A low stage ran along the far wall with a simple podium at its center. Overhead, 3 large screens hung like extra walls, ready to display names, footage, and the live feed the organizers kept talking about. I knew one of those screens would hold my face later. I also knew exactly who would not be in the rows beneath it. Our section sat near the middle of the room. Selma joined me there, a steady presence in a plain black suit, unfazed by the glitter around us. Members of my team filtered in with wide eyes, squeezing my hand or bumping my shoulder as they took their seats. For a few quiet minutes, the noise of the room faded. All I felt was the weight of the moment pressing in from every side. The program began with speeches from officials who had made this kind of stage their second home. They talked about service, sacrifice, and the invisible work that kept cities functioning. I listened, half present, half somewhere else. I tried not to picture my parents and Blair stepping through the doors, tried not to imagine them sliding into the empty seats beside my colleagues. I had sent the message. They had made their choice. Tonight was not about the empty chairs. When the category for emergency services came up, my attention snapped back into the room. A short video played on the screens, showing dispatchers at consoles, crews weaving through traffic, satellite images of city grids at night. A narrator explained what our software did in broad, careful strokes. They mentioned my name once, clean and neutral, and I felt Selma's elbow brush mine. Then the host read from the card in his hand, describing a routing system that has shortened average ambulance response times across the Las Vegas Valley. There was a line about lives reached sooner, about how seconds mattered when people dialed for help. Finally, he said my full name and asked me to come to the stage. Walking to the podium felt like moving underwater. Applause rose and blurred into one sound. The stage lights erased the edges of the crowd, leaving only shapes and flashes. I accepted a glass plaque that caught the light and a handshake from a person whose title I knew, but whose face did not feel entirely real. A photographer captured the angle where I smiled, without quite believing any of it was happening. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a smaller scene played out. I could almost see my family at the concert venue across town, already in their seats while the band finished a song. I imagined the concourse screens cycling through advertisements and then, briefly, a news segment about the event I was standing in. I pictured my own face appearing between beer commercials and tour dates, my name printed along the bottom of a feed they had not bothered to ask about. After I stepped away from the podium and returned to the table, the rest of the program continued around me like a film I had already seen. More names, more applause, more stories of work that usually stayed out of sight. My phone, silent in my bag, buzzed once with a notification as it picked up the building's signal again. Somewhere else in the city, another set of screens flickered, and my family finally saw the thing they had been too busy to attend. After the program ended and the cameras powered down, the ballroom emptied into soft echoes and clinking glassware. I collected my phone from the check-in table and felt it vibrate non-stop in my hand, the screen lighting up with a backlog of notifications that stacked faster than I could clear them. Most of the alerts were what I expected. Messages from co-workers, emails from city officials, a long thread from our operations channel where someone had dropped a blurry screenshot of me on stage. Buried underneath those were dozens of missed calls from the same four numbers and a flood of unread texts in the family thread. The timestamp on the first burst lined up perfectly with the hour the concert would have taken a break. I opened the chat and let the scroll bar jump. At the top sat my invitation, quiet and small. Under it, the reply where my sister had dismissed the award like a pointless errand, and my parents had sided with her. Below that, the tone shifted hard. My mom's messages ran in anxious blocks, talking about giant screens over the arena and people turning to stare when my name appeared. My dad had written about strangers asking if they were related to me, added comments about how proud they felt, how unbelievable it all was. Blair's texts were shorter, clipped, full of exclamation marks that made everything look like a performance for an invisible crowd. I read each message slowly. They described the noise in the venue when the clip from the ceremony appeared. the way nearby fans had tried to take photos of the broadcast, the questions that followed when the caption under my image spelled out my job title. No one mentioned the fact that they had chosen a concert over being in the room. They wrote about shock and pride and disbelief, as if the only thing that mattered was how dramatic the reveal had been. For a moment, an old reflex flared, the instinct to smooth things over and make everyone feel better. I could almost hear myself typing out reassurances, explaining the project in simple terms, shifting the focus away from what they had done and toward how exciting the future looked. My thumbs hovered above the keyboard while that version of the conversation played out in my head. Instead, I locked the screen and lowered the phone. My team was waiting back at the table, caught between celebration and the tiredness that follows a long campaign. Selma lifted an eyebrow when she saw my face and my grip on the device. I shook my head once, not ready to unpack it, and let myself be pulled into the small, practical tasks of the evening, finishing the group photo, thanking the organizers, figuring out which rideshare line to stand in outside the hotel. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had started to quiet. I set the plaque on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and finally opened the phone again. The unread badges had multiplied. Alongside the family thread were messages from distant relatives, old classmates, neighbors from the cul-de-sac where I grew up. Links to news clips sat under their notes, with captions about how wild it was to see my face during a night out on the strip. Back in the family chat, the tone had shifted again. The frantic shock of the first wave had cooled into something more calculated. My mom was asking if the local news might want to talk to them about what it had been like to raise such a dedicated daughter. My dad wondered out loud if the city would be interested in a story about the neighborhood where I came from. Blair floated the idea of posting a throwback picture of us as kids, with a caption about always believing in me. I scrolled until I reached the point where their new plan sat directly above the lines where they had brushed off the invitation. Then I took a series of screenshots and saved them to a folder with a name only I would recognize. I did not reply. The gap between what they were saying now and what they had said before did not feel like something a few late-night messages could close. Outside my window, the strip glowed in its usual colors, indifferent to who had been cheered in ballrooms or concert halls that night. Inside my living room, for the first time in a long time, I let myself sit with the truth of what their words actually meant. Morning settled in without asking what kind of day I wanted it to be. I woke to sunlight leaking past the blinds and the faint vibration of my phone on the nightstand. For a second, I imagined it was just the usual stream of work emails, another cycle of small problems needing quiet fixes. Then I saw the same cluster of names near the top of the screen, layered with senders I had not spoken to in years. I set the device face down and went to make coffee. The quiet of my apartment felt fragile, something I needed to protect before I let other people's reactions in. When the mug was warm in my hands, I sat at the table and unlocked the phone. Reporters had already started circling. 2 local stations were asking for interviews. A regional outlet wanted to film at our office. My department's communications team had sent a note about handling requests, reminding me I did not have to say yes every time someone pointed a camera at me. Beneath that thread, the family chat icon still glowed. When I opened it again, the overnight pattern was clear. After the first wave of shock, my parents had moved straight into planning. They wondered which relatives to call, which neighbors would be most impressed, whether any journalist might want footage of the street where I had grown up. Blair's messages read like drafts for public posts, polished nostalgia and claims about always knowing I was bound for something big. Corey had added a few scattered reactions, as if he was trying to keep his balance without picking a side. I scrolled past everything until I reached the blank line at the bottom. Anything I wrote there would be reread and folded into whatever story they told about us. The difference now was that I finally understood I had a say in how much access they got to the version of me the world had just met. I typed slowly, checking each line before I let it stand. I kept the message short. I acknowledged that the ceremony had been a big moment, that yes, it was strange to see my face on screens in places I had never set foot. Then I drew a boundary. I said I did not want interviews framed around our home life, that I would not participate in features about my childhood, that any story I agreed to tell would focus on the work and on the people who depended on it. I also said it hurt to watch them scramble for ways to benefit from something they had been so quick to dismiss. I did not quote their earlier replies. I did not need to. They were there in the scroll history, and the people most determined to ignore them were the ones who had typed them. I finished by asking them not to contact my coworkers or anyone from the department, and by saying that if a reporter approached them, I hoped they would choose honesty over image. When I hit send, the typing indicator appeared almost immediately. For a few seconds, it flickered on and off, as if no one could quite decide who should speak first. Eventually, my mom's reply arrived in a tight block of text that tried to cover every angle at once. She insisted they were just excited, that they were proud in their own way, that I was overthinking as usual. My dad's response came next, more clipped. He wrote that I should not tell them how to talk about their own daughter, that they had sacrificed plenty over the years, that he did not appreciate being made to feel like a villain on a night that should have been a celebration. Blair did not send a paragraph. She fired off a few messages instead, each one sharper than the last, accusing me of being ungrateful, of trying to embarrass them, of acting as if I had raised myself. Their words landed with less force than they might have even a year earlier. Instead of reshaping my sense of what had happened, they sounded like echoes from a room I had already stepped out of. I read them, waited to see if any part of me wanted to jump back into the familiar argument about who had done what for whom, and felt only a tired kind of clarity. I closed the chat without replying and opened the email from our communications team again. They had attached a short media guide about boundaries and not feeling obligated to share details that made me uneasy. Near the end was a line about how the people closest to us could sometimes be the least prepared for public attention, and how it was okay to enforce distance. Looking at those words, I realized I did not have to wait for anything to change. Distance was not a punishment here. It was a set of coordinates I could choose for myself. I went back to the family thread one last time and muted it for a full year. Then I opened the individual conversation windows one by one and switched their alerts off as well. The messages would still arrive if they sent them, but my home would stay quiet unless I decided otherwise. The weeks that followed did not feel like a victory lap. They felt like a reset. At work, the award turned into a kind of shorthand. New people joined the team and had to be told why strangers sometimes showed up with cameras. Dispatchers stopped me in the hallway to share small details I never saw on a dashboard. A child who reached a hospital before a seizure spiraled. An elderly neighbor who did not have to spend a night alone on the floor because a crew arrived fast enough to help her back up. Selma used the media attention to push for more funding, more staff, more stubborn people who hated unsolved problems as much as I did. Inside that momentum, my personal life rearranged itself around quieter choices. I kept my phone number, but I removed the family thread from my home screen. I went to dinner with coworkers who had become friends, people who knew how much the project had cost and did not need me to shrink it to make them comfortable. I met with students visiting the department, answered their questions about burnout and purpose, and told them plainly that the work mattered more than any headline. Occasionally, pieces of my old life slipped through. A mutual acquaintance would mention that my parents had framed a news clipping and hung it in the living room. Someone from our street back home would send a direct message saying my mom talked about me nonstop at neighborhood gatherings now, always skipping the part where she had skipped the ceremony. Once, a distant cousin forwarded a long email my dad had written about raising a daughter who never needed much from us, as if distance were a point of pride. I read those secondhand updates the way I might read a weather report for a city I no longer planned to visit. They described conditions that could not hurt me unless I stepped back into them. I chose not to. Blair tried a different route. When she realized I was not responding in the group chat, she began posting about me online, tagging my account in old photos and writing sentimental captions about always believing in my little sister. I sent her one direct message, my first in months, stating clearly that I did not want our relationship presented that way, and that if she continued, I would block her everywhere and ask the department's legal team to step in if necessary. She removed the tags. She kept posting, but without my name. That was what consequences look like in my world. Not public scenes or dramatic confrontations, just a series of closed doors. My parents could brag to anyone who would listen, but they could not reach me directly. Blair could perform nostalgia for her audience, but she could not rewrite what had actually happened. Corey could sit on the fence as long as he liked, but the path back into my daily life had been cut off the night they decided a concert mattered more than showing up. What stayed open were the parts of my life I chose with intention. I kept working on the routing system and the projects that followed it. I volunteered to mentor interns who reminded me of the version of myself that once sat in a childhood bedroom, quietly teaching a computer to listen. I joined a small group that reviewed near misses and tried to learn from each one, not because a committee might notice, but because somewhere on the other end of a call, a stranger was waiting. If there is any lesson in all of this, it is not that success fixes the past or that public recognition heals private neglect. It does neither. The real change came when I stopped treating my family's attention as a prize I had to keep earning. I built a life where the people closest to me knew what I did, cared about why it mattered, and showed up long before a camera ever did. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: you are allowed to draw your own lines. You are allowed to decide which invitations matter and which do not. You are allowed to walk away from people who only remember your worth when someone else spells it out for them on a screen. Distance is not cruelty when it keeps you whole. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it made you think about your own boundaries or the way you value the people around you, take a moment after this video to check in with yourself and with the person in your life who might still be waiting for someone to show up when there are no lights and no applause.